I'm sure you're all familiar with today's speaker, David Blake, who came to us from Syracuse and received both his master's and PhD here. He successfully defended in February, which we're all very happy about. And his dissertation is entitled Bildung Culture, Elite Popular Music in the American University, 1960 to 2010. And I believe that that's what he's going to talk to us about today. The title of his talk is The Inclusion of Popular Culture and Class Borders of University Taste. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Thank you to videographer Terena, Michael, Ben, Bethany, and Peter. It's very nice to see you. So, shall begin? A couple of you have seen versions of this before, but it is different. Electric guitars mix freely with violins, and everything is indeed permitted. In this exhortation from his 2011 monograph, Geometry of Music, Harmony and Counterpoint in the Extended Common Practice, music theorist Dmitry Tomachko suggests a cultural zeitgeist, the breakdown of traditionally high and low cultural categories in the service of a greater cultural inclusivity. If the modernist great divide between highbrow and lowbrow dominated 20th century culture, the 21st century appears to witness a more equitable and inclusive consideration of all cultural realms. It is difficult to find a cultural arena without the crossover between high and low. Artesian shops of peasant foods abound in Brooklyn. Chefs combine sautins and Twinkies on television cooking contests. Musicians from both popular and art spheres, including Caroline Shaw, Nico Muhly, and Sufjan Stevens, combine both worlds within the indie classical movement. Theater has witnessed the entanglement, to invoke Chris Salter, of technology and performance, producing new hybrids resisting traditional artistic categorizations. If Tomachko's quote suggests these realms, he is specifically describing the recent co-consideration of art and popular culture in academia. At the Sound and Affect conference held in this room last weekend, attendees heard a pair of keynotes on Friday night discussing Mohammed Fairouz's Symphony No. 3 and Ludacris's Rest of My Life, respectively. Such a combination is fitting in a humanities building housing English, cultural studies, and European languages, literatures, and cultures departments, all disciplines with extensive scholarly discussions over popular culture. By crossing disciplines, methodologies, time periods, and genres, scholars have sought to redress the borders of modernist humanities in the wake of multiculturalism. Yet recent scholarship by musicologist Tamara Levitz, historian Celia Applegate, and others has re-examined inclusivity, arguing that its discourses of tolerance produced a Schengen zone, in Applegate's words, that veils the exclusions maintained along its borders. Though these critiques have aptly counteracted the giddy expansionism Levitz associates with inclusivity, they treat inclusivity as an essentially superstructural term, a change in ethics that masks structural inequalities. In doing so, they do not account for what is possibly the most fundamental material influence on the humanities, the institutional bounds of the universities in which they are predominantly situated. The recent interest in inclusivity within the humanities did not arise on a sheer ideological plane, but from changes to American universities that have reshaped its taste politics. Through an examination of recent musicological writing, this presentation argues that inclusivity within the humanities reflects an omnivorous taste paradigm currently dominant within higher education. I draw upon omnivore theory, a sociological theory of taste which correlates education with the number of musical genres a listener appreciates. Omnivore theory describes a fundamental shift in the taste disposition produced in higher education over the past 2 decades, from a highbrow exclusive taste to a petite bourgeois inclusive taste, demonstrating by appreciating culture from both traditionally high and low musical spheres. I will examine scholarly omnivory through a close reading of 2 recent books that bridge art and popular music, Michael Long's Beautiful Monsters, Imagining the Classic in Musical Media, and Tomachko's aforementioned A Geometry of Music. Both books assert an essential sameness across musical categories, long from a cultural standpoint to Mochko from a theoretical one, that counters the hierarchizations of an assumed exclusive taste paradigm. My analyses are governed by the maxim that human nature abhors a vacuum. That is, if the turn to repertorial inclusivity in these works in part repels former taste paradigms, it also implicitly gravitates towards new ones. I hope to unpack the stakes of inclusivity in order to account for two facets of its appearance in the contemporary humanities. First, the ethics ascribed to inclusivity, and second, the way in which inclusivity tacitly maintains class borders. By understanding this new taste paradigm via omnivore theory, I hope to better sketch out the covert and causal values of inclusivity, to invoke musicologist Janet Levy, as demonstrated within musicological discourse, to foster a more nuanced dialogue about the relationship of the ethics, exclusions, and blindnesses of inclusion in the humanities to its formative socioeconomic and institutional influences. One final point, half of you here are in music, and this talk does mostly discuss music scholarship and is being revised for a musicological journal. But I'm hoping that those here who are not in music, that the ideas I'm presenting resonates with disciplinary ideas, and I hope that that comes out, especially in Q&A. The relationship between the university and its constituent culture has long been acknowledged but analytically problematic. It has either been overdetermined, as in the conception of the cloistered ivory tower, or impossibly vague, as in the idea of the university propagated by John Henry Newman or the mission of Ortega y Gasset, among others. Part of the reason is the impossible vastness of the contemporary American university, an amalgamation of different divergent schools and communities that Clark Kerr has called the multiversity. In his Heartland Excursions, one of the few ethnomusicological studies of the university, Bruno Nettel concluded by admitting that, quote, "It's a complicated place, existing as it does at a number of crossroads," end quote. A number of these crossroads between private and public interests, cultural uplift and social outreach, disinterested and utilitarian study, and universality and privilege, are central features of the American university that complicate a simple relationship between institution and culture. As a result, I conceive of this relationship through taste, and in particular, I follow Pierre Bourdieu's theorization of education as a habitus of dispositions. The habitus can be understood as an unconscious perception of how subjective cultural preferences, or tastes, fit within a perceived objective environment. The habitus has been applied to numerous cultural fields in the humanities, but Bourdieu frequently discussed higher education as a habitus that shapes tastes. In distinction, Bourdieu demonstrated how higher education and class combine to legitimize taste by producing perceived, institutionally regulated cultural differences. And I quote, "The official differences produced by academic classifications tend to produce or reinforce real differences by inducing in the classified individuals a collectively recognized and supported belief in the differences, thus producing behaviors that are intended to bring real being into line with official being." This is one of the more transparent of Bourdieu's statements. Universities produce taste through institutionally sanctioned cultural distinctions from which people position themselves. Music especially delineates taste in class formations, since, to quote him again, "nothing classifies more rigorously than tastes in music." Thus, despite music's somewhat peripheral location in humanities scholarship, it can quite richly illuminate the university's taste formations. And in Homo Academicus, he also talks about the humanities and the social sciences more broadly as a place where this can happen, since those fields are both focused on scientific research and cultural preservation. So what disposition is produced in the university? Bourdieu himself posited the production of a species that, in following his 1984 study of French academe, I will call Homo Academicus. Bourdieu connected higher education with dominant power structures. His early writings examined how education functioned to reproduce the conditions of its own privilege. In distinction, Bourdieu depicted intellectual taste as a form of highbrow bourgeois taste defined through an exclusionary cultural disposition towards highbrow culture that was opposed to lowbrow culture. Given its location at the top of the economic and cultural food chain, so to speak, Homo academicus has the social power to reproduce and normalize its cultural preferences across other habituses, granting cultural capital to its exclusions. While Bourdieu's theorization of education and taste informs the methodological basis of this study, his description of a highbrow Homo academicus reflects mid-20th century French academe rather than the 21st century American university. Of course, drawing conclusions about American context using models based on French society has been questioned since de Tocqueville's comparison of democratic Americans and the aristocratic French. More recently, a century and a half later, sociologist Michel Lemont has found a, quote, pervasive explicit non-exclusiveness in the cultural disposition of American elites, countering the homologous relationship between class education and taste assumed in Bourdieu's model. More substantial than broad national cultural differences, though, are the vast changes to the American university since Bourdieu's research. Increased enrollment has broadened the demographics of university education. The growth of youth-oriented popular music, combined with rapid increases in technological circulation and relaxations of student behavior regulations, encouraged the development of campus-based popular music activity. Finally, the introduction of multicultural curricula and the commitment to diversity following the civil rights movements of the 60s have legitimated new academic fields and perspectives. These developments have inundated the university with popular culture since World War II, producing a cultural ecosystem that has profoundly altered the shape of dominant academic taste paradigms. While Bourdieu theorized Homo academicus in the late 1970s, early 80s, the species was nearly extinct in America by the previous decade. Sociologist Harold Walensky claimed in 1966 that, quote, educated strata are becoming full participant in mass culture, a claim echoed by Susan Sontag's contemporaneous discussion of the new sensibility. Even Bourdieu had noted in distinction that, quote, higher education teachers have very high competence even in less consecrated areas, such as cinema. Beginning in the 1990s, sociological scholarship has refuted the highbrow model of educated taste described in Bourdieu's work. Today, higher education correlates to a more inclusive taste, predisposed towards appreciating a diverse range of music. Sociologists Richard Peterson and Albert Simkus coined the term omnivore to label this new inclusive paradigm. Elite taste, they write, is no longer defined as an expressed appreciation of the high art forms and a moral disdain or bemused tolerance for all other aesthetic expressions. Now it is being redefined as an appreciation of the aesthetics of every distinctive form, along with an appreciation of the high arts. Because status is gained by knowing about and participating in, that is to say, by consuming all forms. The term omnivore seems appropriate. Omnivory demonstrates what sociologist Michel Olivier has called the rhetoric of openness to cultural diversity through cultural preferences. If the cultural consumption of Homo academicus traded in cultural capital, this is Bourdieu's term, sociologist Bethany Bryson argues that Homo omnivorous uses multicultural capital, which she calls a, quote, social prestige afforded by familiarity with a range of cultural styles that is both broad and predictably exclusive. For Bryson, multicultural capital entails both a demonstration of an inclusive breadth through cross-cultural appreciation and a concomitant entrenched exclusion towards genres associated either with lower class, intra-racial listeners or exclusive highbrow taste paradigms. In distinguishing between both lower class and highbrow listeners, omnivores therefore position themselves rhetorically and socioeconomically as petit bourgeois rather than bourgeois. In distinction, Bourdieu theorized the taste of the petit bourgeois as open to cultural variety due to middle-class social origins and bourgeois aspirations, but described it as a disposition dominated by and imitative of the bourgeois. The ability of the petit bourgeois to transverse art and popular culture, though, has construed exclusive bourgeois taste as restrictive and passé, shifting the cultural power within the multicultural multiversity from the bourgeois intellectual to a petite bourgeois form of intellectualism. To summarize, and here are species, academicus and omnivorous. The dominance of Homo academicus, a snobbish, exclusive taste defined by a bourgeois class position in trading in cultural capital, has been supplanted by Homo omnivorous, an inclusive taste paradigm that suggests a petite bourgeois class position in trades in multicultural capital. This shift exemplifies how changes in the 21st century university have reshaped the contours of legitimate taste. I am arguing that omnivory is a practical application of a disposition derived from a multicultural turn in higher education that has both broadened the amount of potentially legitimate culture while also maintaining class-based cultural distinctions. The close readings to follow analyze two recent prominent books in music scholarship, which each fit the omnivore paradigm. They intentionally cross art and popular repertoires. They oppose their boundary crossing to a perceived dominant highbrow paradigm, and they claim an ethics of border crossing based not only on the ontology of their subject matter, which is seen in of itself to challenge the highbrow-lowbrow divide, but as a way to more honestly represent themselves in their scholarship. If these scholars believe they are transgressing a dominant highbrow taste via omnivorous taste, though, I will be asking in the conclusion whether they are actually transgressing or reiterating dominant class paradigms, and suggesting how inclusiveness can retain a critical politics without reifying the neoliberal cultural politics that have recently encroached into academia. So you don't have to actually be able to read this, but what's most important is that you see at the very top that this is a blog called The Studies of Popular Culture and the Middle Ages. On this slide is the blog of the Virtual Society for the Study of Popular Culture and the Middle Ages. Founded in 2003, the group's blog highlights conferences and journals in English and cultural studies that interface medieval and popular culture. They do this a few ways, looking at medievalisms in contemporary popular culture, in trying to access the popular culture of the medieval period, which is notoriously difficult, or crossing the two. You get further down in the blog, you get pedagogy papers that say, let's teach this 12th century English text through O.J. Simpson's If I Did It, which is actually on there. But this is a scholarly group that is tracking mostly literature and cultural studies. According to their mission statement, the group intends to, quote, bring medievalists and popular culture specialists into contact with the ultimate goal to make medieval studies a richer field for investigation. Notice the arrow in which that takes place. Popular culture can enrich medieval studies. As can be surmised, this virtual society exists to bridge the gap between medieval studies and popular culture studies, a schism quite familiar to humanities scholars. It is no accident that the cover of Bourdieu's Homo academicus features a medieval illumination of French magisters. The dominance of medieval and Renaissance music during modernist musicology has turned that area into a symbol for musicology's former exclusive tastes. Yet its scholars have been no less sequestered from popular music as their colleagues who studied more contemporary musics over the past few decades. Medieval and Renaissance scholars thus faced a vast disparity between academically sanctioned taste and private taste, making the discussion of popular music in an academic setting a liberating possibility. In musicology, the medieval and Renaissance fields have produced a number of such liberated omnivores in musicology, including Charles Ham, the first musicologist to publish on American popular music, who was an early 15th century Continence Anglois and Franco-Flemish polyphonist scholar, Susan McClary, Susan Fast, Paula Higgins, and the author of Beautiful Monsters, Michael Long, who received his PhD from Princeton in 1981 with a dissertation on Italian tercento music. In 2008, Long published Beautiful Monsters, Imagining the Classic in Musical Media, which discusses not Landini or Jacopo di Bologna, but rather the permanence of the classical in the production of meaning in mass-mediated music. In claiming the centrality of the classical within the popular, he presents his study as the intentional crossing of both cultural and disciplinary borders. In his introduction, he laments the perceived distinction between academic cultural categories and public listening practices. Quote, "The embarrassment academics daily confront when we half-heartedly recite categories of art and popular that we know are meaningless or wrong, and the extent to which we still regularly frame our own language in air, scare, or typographical quotes, suggests that if we could comfortably recategorize the objects of our discourse, we would likely do so." Beautiful Monsters attempts to recategorize the classical and academic discourse through examining its interpenetration into the broader public imagination. To do so, Long radically reconceives the classical by changing the discursive field in which the classical operates from a schema of musical categories to a vernacular, a concept he refers to, quote, "simply in the sense of something commonly shared or understood by a community." Given the circulation of all kinds of musics through musical media, his use of vernacular is intended to complicate the neat cultural divisions of the highbrow, lowbrow paradigm. Freed from cultural hierarchy through the conception of the vernacular, Long defines classical as an expressive register. Classical is not simply the musics conventionally associated with highbrow culture, but rather a linkage between, quote, "the sensory aspects of cultural products," i.e. the aesthetics, and, quote, "the expressive value of the registers," i.e. the collections, in which they are understood to be located, end quote. That is, music can be heard and used as classical without itself being classical. Though much of his book discusses film music, a genre whose scholarship has long been defined by its liminal space between cultural registers and disciplinary approaches, I want to focus my reading today on how Long rethinks the classical through an omnivorous crossing of traditionally high and low musics. Long does not explicitly define the classical register. He hints at some aspects of it: memory, memorialization, monumentality. Instead, he demonstrates it through the use of the classic by two rather different authors. Aulus Gellius, the 2nd century Roman author of the eclectic Noctes Atticae, or Attic Nights, and Michael Jackson, the king of pop. Jackson equated I'll skip Gellius because he doesn't only talk about music. Jackson equated classical music with, quote, "several familiar standards, including Childhood, Smile, and People by Barbra Streisand." But rather than chastising Jackson for his gaucherie, Long recuperates his tastes as a meaningful assemblage of musics wherein the classical figures as a, quote, "reconfigured fragment within pop and Broadway repertoires." Jackson's classical makes perfect sense for him and also confounds the ontologies of academic cultural hierarchies. The potential radical break between classical as an expressive register and classical as a cultural category marks the politics of taste demonstrated in Beautiful Monsters. The juxtaposition between Gellius and Jackson is one of many examples where Long illustrates his points through combining reference from vastly different cultural categories and historical periods. Long argues that a wide referential gambit crossing cultural boundaries is necessary to examine the multifaceted reconfigurations of the classical. And this is a fairly lengthy quote, but direct relationships between Andrei Tarkovsky and Procol Harum, the avant-garde Russian film director in Whiter Shade of Pale, T.S. Eliot and Michael Jackson, or Bugs Bunny and Freddie Mercury, might be trivial or even non-existent. The webs in which they have been mutually implicated are not, however, and these transcend directional associations of influence, imitation, or referentiality. While my text is bookended by Dante and the Sony PlayStation, respectively, there is no continuous chronological trajectory to its organization. In discussing 60s prog rock, alongside avant-garde Russian film, alongside cartoons, alongside T.S. Eliot, within a text that apparently offers canzonas to Lara Croft, Long explicitly claims to resist standard cultural constraints. His discussions bear out the wide cultural range implied in this introduction. In chapter 1, for example, Long launches into his theorization of the vernacular and the register that discusses, in order, Dante's Divulgare Eloquentia, the Trashman's Surf and Bird, which is a song that goes bird, 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 the bird is the word, the bird, the bird. Jan and Dean's Baby Talk, Barry Mann's Who Put the Bomp in the Bomp, the Bomp, the Bomp, and Andreas Capellanos's De Amore, a 12th century treatise on love. These are within the same paragraph. I have summarized some similar combinations here. So pages 35 to 36, we move from Barry Manilow to rapper DMX, to the trope of severed hand literature used in early 19th century German literature and 1930s film, and the 1940s film composer Bronislaw Kaper. Later on, we get the Doors, Christian Wolff, who is a late Baroque German composer, Buxtehude, who's a 17th century German composer, and Ray Conniff, who in the mid-century did all these arrangements of Tchaikovsky and Bach and etc. Next we have Tarkovsky, Verdi's Requiem, to A Whiter Shade of Pale, to The Sorrows of Young Werther, to The Soldier's Dream. And then lastly, the early girl group song, A Lover's Concerto by the Toys, which moves to The Merchant of Venice, which moves back to Frankie Valli, the song Silence is Golden, to Ars Predicandi, or The Medieval Art of Preaching, to Stairway to Heaven, to the Canterbury Tales, to Johannes Ockingham, who is a 15th century Franco-Flemish polyphonist. This is within 1.5 pages. It's a fun read. Through radically combining different historical moments, Long, to paraphrase the Virtual Society of the Study of Popular Music in the Middle Ages mission statement, brings classical and popular culture into contact with the ultimate goal to make the classical a richer field for investigation. So now I'm going to move to the next, to Machko's Geometry of Music. In 1958, the Princeton composer and music theorist Milton Babbitt published the most notorious documentation of Homo academicus, the composer as specialist, also titled Who Cares If You Listen? His article argued that composers should seek the patronage of the university to develop musical composition as an intellectual discipline rather than pandering to the familiar aesthetic parameters necessitated by public audiences. Babbitt's assertion emblemized the fundamental change in 20th century art music composition from the public to the academic world, and in doing so concretized the separation between university art composition and public popular music. A half-century later, another Princeton composer and music theorist, Dmitri Tomachko, would take it upon himself to demonstrate Homo Omnivorous by asserting instead an objective technical sameness between classical and popular music repertoires. His 2011 monograph, A Geometry of Music, Harmony and Counterpoint in the Extended Common Practice, argues that 20th century art and popular music are part of the same broadly defined Western tonal tradition, the titular Extended Common Practice, extending from the beginnings of polyphony in the 9th century to the present day. In his introduction, Tomachko describes himself as a natural omnivore at odds with his undergraduate professors at Harvard. And quote, "To a kid growing up in a college town in the 1980s, the musical world seemed wide open. You could play The Rite of Spring with your rock band, write symphonies for electric guitars, or do anything else you might imagine. I was somewhat surprised, therefore, to find that my college teachers, famous academics and composers, inhabited an entirely different musical universe. As I quickly learned, in this environment, not everything was possible. This precedes the liberatory quote that I opened with. Though he cites Milton Babbitt in his acknowledgement section, he also refers to his relationship to the Princeton composition department as filled with, quote, the slings and arrows of outraged forefathers, end quote. In contrast to these supposedly outraged forefathers, Tomachko's book seeks to schematize compositional techniques uniting differently categorized musics. He writes that, quote, it would make me happy to think that these ideas, in his book, will be helpful to some young musician brimming with excitement over the world of musical possibilities, eager to understand how classical music, jazz, and rock all fit together. He conceives of these three musical categories, classical, jazz, and rock, as tonal musics that, despite surface differences, share the same basic compositional procedures. He cites 5 features of all tonal music: conjunct music, melodic motion, so da 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 da, rather than ba ba bum bum. Consonants, things sounding nice. Harmonic consistency, things staying in the same sort of harmonic world. Limited macro harmony, which is a fancy way of saying the limited amount of harmonic areas in a given time span. And centricity, the prominence of a given note at a given time period. He argues that these features are fundamental through conceiving of pitch and harmonic movement as essentially geometric. And here is an example from his book. Do not ask me what this means. I got that and that. His analyses employ topographical structures such as orbifolds, matrices, three-dimensional figures, and Mobius strips to analyze canonic pieces and or demonstrate potential logical musical motion within a given style. In appealing to mathematics, Tomachko asserts an objective scientific connection between discursively and institutionally separated genres. In Chapter 9, Tomachko illustrates these techniques in 20th century music by juxtaposing analyses of art and popular repertoires. This chapter defines 20th century tonal music as scalar music, music in which, quote, non-diatonic scales are used to accompany functionally harmonic progressions. In other words, there's sort of a structural harmony that's underlying, but there are pitch collections up top that sort of obfuscate that. He discusses scale-first composition, a technique whereby composers modulate between closely related scales through not only Debussy and Shostakovich, but the Who's I Can't Explain and Bob Seger's Turn the Page. A discussion of subset technique, a type of scale-first composition wherein composers use multiple scales cohered by shared pitch material, uses a comparative analysis of the Beatles' Help and the Dance of the Adolescents from Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, which, if you know that piece, is the familiar clangorous opening. By connecting these repertoires through shared techniques, Tomachko asserts an inherent objective kinship between popular and art music that rejects the categorical divides of modernist composition. Quote, the procedures we have been discussing have entered the musical vernacular. Not only can they be found in works of self-conscious art music, but also in film music, jazz, rock, and no doubt in other styles as well. By coincidence, Tomachko's argument here returns to the same word stressed in Long's reformulation of the classical, the vernacular. Indeed, Long and Tomachko's texts share a number of similarities. They intentionally blur cultural boundaries in favor of asserting essential unities. Both position their work against the rigid cultural hierarchies of highbrow taste. Both adroitly use provocative juxtapositions to provide evidence for their overarching theses. And both embrace openness as a productive disciplinary trajectory, replacing the borders of the specialist with the cross-cultural perspective of the generalist. If both texts speak of the vernaculars, though, I wish to ask, whose vernacular is this? Here I return back to omnivore theory and assert that both authors cross cultural boundaries via multicultural capital and a petite bourgeois class position that not only tacitly excludes certain musics, but other perspectives on included music. Tymoczko's limitations are apparent in his popular examples, which are limited to the rock artists long canonized in academia, such as the Beatles, The Who, and Radiohead. He readily admits that his texts focus on pitch amidst other musical characteristics, but music theorists have long argued the primacy of other parameters like rhythm, timbre, texture, and recording quality in popular music's composition and reception, especially in genres marginalized by pitch-centric approaches such as hip-hop or EDM. Long is more careful to include more marginalized repertoire, including a lengthy discussion on classic samples used by hip-hop artists DMX and Busta Rhymes, and that's where that first collection comes from. Yet in traversing vast cultural terrain to illuminate his musical examples, his analyses slip between his omnivorous approach to culture and the perhaps more localized and limited cultural worlds of his subjects. In other words, does comparing Michael Jackson to Alice Jalius actually tell us something about Jackson's vernacular, or does it merely tell us about Long's? In their excitement over analyzing multiple sides of their tastes in their academic writing, neither Long nor Tymoczko examine what repertoires and perspectives remain detained at the borders of omnivory. This neglect is not necessarily a particular shortcoming of these authors. The reason I pick these books is that they're really quite interesting and provocative works that are really quite rich and important, but rather speaks to the paradoxes of the multiversity and its uneasy relationship to class. Omnivore theory helps understand the particular forms of inclusion as predicated on both the petite bourgeois class position and the demonstration of multicultural capital, which transfers yet maintains class border. Yet in critiquing inclusivity, however, I'm not echoing conservative critiques of multicultural studies by nostalgically pining for a supposedly simpler, purer exclusivity. Rather recognizes that inclusivity is not pure inclusivity as such, but rather recognizes reflects a particular taste paradigm. As such, Homo omnivorous is actually as much of a product of the university as Homo academicus, subject to its taste paradigms and paradoxes. Both books in particular struggle with the desire to forge dialogue across diverse perspectives without undoing the university's traditional association with elite culture. The tension between universality and privilege and the fuzzy borders between the university and its public lead Long and Tymoczko to stress the cultural sophistication of popular genres and assert the vernacularity of art music while resisting the permanence of musical hierarchies. This negotiation of this tension results in the class position of Homo omnivorous and its subsequent focus on multicultural capital. Rather than framing inclusivity in resistance to Homo academicus as Long and Tymoczko have done, then, the present humanities should more move towards situating it through the ethics and tensions of the class borders of university culture. Omnivory cannot solve and in a sense reifies class inequality. However, I argue that an omnivory used to reject institutional logics through ascribing a reactionary highbrow taste to academia risks replacing academic criticality with a form of cultural neoliberalism. Literary scholar Jody Malamed describes neoliberalist multiculturalism as the prizing of diversity through individual agency that masks the social mechanisms which produce systemic inequality. And you can see this in Long and Tymoczko's words, where they feel they have to incorporate all of these different styles into their works. In universities that have become both more diverse and less economically integrated in recent years, foregrounding intuitive individual creativity while rejecting institutional logics risks obfuscating self-privilege and colonial residues. Instead, omnivory can forge what Bill Reddings has called a, quote, university of dissensus, a community unified through dialogue committed to sharing ideas between irrevocably different perspectives. Through critical reflection of the legacies of the overriding social, cultural, and economic structures that have enabled the ethics and dilemmas of omnivory, the humanities can retain a vital political function by critically interrogating musical difference through dialogues of dissensus. Such reflection would continue to ensure that omnivory in the humanities is a space for cautiously giddy dialogue of inclusivity rather than a demonstration of neoliberal multiculturalism. Thank you.